Do you know why you should always challenge IRS penalties? I'm Andrew Bosserman, tax attorney and founder of Boss Tax Law, and in this video I'm going to explain why it generally pays to challenge IRS penalties. Here's something that may surprise you. So the IRS abates, and that's just a fancy word for canceling or waiving millions of dollars of penalties every year. And many taxpayers who challenge their penalties properly can get them reduced or oftentimes eliminated entirely. So if you've received a penalty notice from the IRS, don't just pay it automatically. I'm going to show you why challenging these penalties can save you serious money and stress. So the IRS issues penalties for all sorts of reasons. It can be for filing late, for paying late, for underreporting your income, for not paying enough in estimated taxes, and many other reasons. There are lots of different types of IRS penalties. And these penalties can range from a few hundred to thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of dollars. And here's the thing. The IRS system that generates these penalties, it's pretty much automated. And it's essentially a computer program that's deciding whether or not to charge you tens of thousands of dollars in penalties. But what many business owners don't realize is that the IRS actually has programs in place specifically designed to provide penalty relief. The most common is called First-Time Abatement, but I'm also going to discuss others like reasonable cause and some others. So let's first talk about why people don't challenge penalties. Most people oftentimes just pay penalties without question. And one of these reasons is probably due to fear. It can be intimidating to deal with the IRS. The letters they send out are official and look threatening. They threaten liens, levies, and maybe even more superior penalties, interest. That's enough to make anyone nervous unless you deal with the IRS on a regular basis. Also, lack of knowledge. You just might not know that you can challenge penalties, or even if you might not know the procedures of how to challenge penalties. And also, many taxpayers assume it might be more difficult to get penalties abated than it is. For example, if you qualify for first-time abatement, the process is pretty straightforward, and it's not necessarily always super complicated, time-consuming, or requires professional help. Oftentimes, challenging a penalty is well worth the investment of time and or money you might have to spend to have a tax professional help you with it. So let's talk about the three main types of penalty relief. The first type is called first-time abatement. And this is the easiest way to get relief if you have a clean compliance history, which generally means you haven't had any penalties in the past 3 years. You've filed all required returns or have extensions if returns are currently due, and you've paid or arranged to pay any tax due. And those are just some general requirements. There may be more specific requirements in some instances, but generally if you've filed and paid on time, you can qualify for first-time abatement. This is essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card. The IRS offers it since it's your first mistake, but the IRS doesn't always advertise it, so you actually need to ask for it. They won't automatically apply it. The second way you can get penalty relief is through reasonable cause. And this is when you have a legitimate reason for not complying with your tax obligations. So think of things like natural disasters, death or serious illness of you or someone in your family, unavoidable absence, sometimes military or having to be away for whatever reason for certain periods of time, fire, casualties, other major disturbances to your life, inability to obtain records. Sometimes this is an issue if you're an investor in the company and they don't issue K-1s or other documents. And then sometimes bad advice from tax professionals will also qualify under reasonable cause, although you have to make some pretty good arguments to qualify based on that reasoning. But the key here in all of these reasons is that you made a good faith effort to comply. You did everything you could, but there were some circumstances outside your control which led you not to be able to file or pay or otherwise meet your tax obligations timely. So that's the second way you can get penalties abated. The third way is there's some other statutory exceptions. So there's things like you received incorrect written advice from the IRS, there was some sort of delays by the IRS in processing your case or doing something they were required to do, or if they made some sort of erroneous refund or credit. Oftentimes you can get penalties waived in those situations. And that's just a few examples. There's a number of other statutory exceptions. So we've gone through the 3 ways you can request penalty abatement. That was first-time abatement, reasonable cause, other exceptions. Let's talk about how to request penalty abatement. So there's 3 ways you can request penalty abatement. The first option is a phone call. You can call the IRS and you'll generally call the number that was on the IRS notice that informed you of your penalty. If you do it this way, you want to have your notice ready, a copy of your tax return, and any documents you think you might need. Calling works best for first-time abatement because the IRS can check your compliance history and generally grant the abatement over the phone in a fairly quick period of time. If you do happen to call the IRS, remember to get the IRS representative's name and ID number and take notes of your conversation just in case you need it for the future. So that's a phone call and generally works best for first-time abatement. You can also send a written request to the IRS for penalty abatement, and this is just a letter and you'd send it to the address listed on your IRS notice. You include things like your name, address, taxpayer ID number. You want to discuss the penalty you want abated, the tax period it was assessed on, and explain what kind of relief you want, generally full abatement of the penalty. And you want to include your explanation of why you're entitled to abatement. That could be first-time abatement, reasonable cause. You want detailed facts and specifics of why whatever the circumstance was didn't allow you to meet your tax obligations and was outside of your control. And also want to include supporting documentation. So the thing that supports your abatement request, that could be documents supporting a natural disaster, death certificate, doctor's note, anything along those lines. And then finally, you want to sign the letter. That's the second way. The third way to request penalty abatement is to prepare and file a Form 843. And the title of this form is Claim for Refund and Request for Abatement. It has a lot of the information that would be included in the letter, but it's more formal. It's an actual IRS form. And I often file this form just because it is more formal. The IRS has to process it, and generally they will send you a letter in response, either accepting or denying your abatement claim. So the way I normally approach abatement is if it qualifies for first-time abatement, I normally try to call first. If not, then I will file Form 843. That's because first-time abatement requests are generally successful if you meet the qualification criteria. There's not really arguing over facts and circumstances. It's an administrative waiver that the IRS is instructed to grant when taxpayers qualify. But reasonable cause requests are much more subjective and more difficult to prove, which is oftentimes why they're initially denied. Success depends heavily on your specific circumstances and how well you document your case, but also how well you present it to the IRS. So to maximize your chances of success with penalty abatement, you'll want to act quickly. You need to respond promptly to penalty notices. Generally, they give you 30 to 60 days to contest the penalty. So you'll want to call or file a letter or form by then. You also want to be honest and specific. You don't lie, exaggerate, or make vague claims. Provide exact dates, names, circumstances, and you're going to want to follow this up with documentation. For reasonable cause claims, supporting evidence is crucial. Medical records, information about natural disasters, a fire or other casualty that occurred, correspondence, all of that can be helpful in supporting your case. Also, you want to make sure that you're persistent, but you want to be polite also. Oftentimes, especially in reasonable cause situations, your first abatement request will be denied, but you can appeal. And oftentimes, you can get the penalty issue resolved with IRS appeals, which is it's supposedly an independent part of the IRS that will review IRS decisions and oftentimes will reverse what the IRS did, or they'll take a closer look because they are weighing kind of looking at what happens if this goes to litigation, how good is the taxpayer's case, etc. And also, you'll want to consider professional help for larger or more complex penalties. So for substantial penalties, or if you have to argue reasonable cause, consulting with a tax professional like myself might be worth the investment, because oftentimes you will both save time, but also, even though you might have to pay someone like me, if the penalty is fully abated, it's oftentimes well worth the investment. So a few common questions I receive is, can you still get penalty abatement if you've had penalties before? Yes, you can, but you may have to request them under a reasonable cause. Because remember, first-time abatement only works if you've had a clean compliance history for the 3 years preceding the year of the penalty. Can you request penalty abatement for multiple years? Yes, I've done this plenty of times before, but you may have to request it under different methods for different periods. First-time abatement will generally only work for the first period, but then you may have to request additional periods based on reasonable cause. And what if you already paid the penalty? The good news is, even if you paid the penalty, you can generally still request abatement within 2 to 3 years of payment of the penalty and potentially receive a refund. You will want to make sure that you file a claim for the refund or a lawsuit within the statute of limitations dates. So there's deadlines. You can't just wait years down the road and then request the refund. You must do it timely. It's generally 2 to 3 years. It'll depend on payment and the filing date. But even if you paid the penalty already, all hope is not lost. You can still get that back. The good news is that the IRS has a taxpayer bill of rights that says you have the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. And that includes also not paying penalties that can be legitimately abated. So don't let, fear or lack of information or not knowing how to go about penalty abatement cost you money. Definitely take a few minutes to challenge that penalty or hire someone to do it for you. And your future self will thank you once you get the penalty waived or get the money back in your pocket. So if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe for more practical tax tips for dealing with the IRS. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them or include them in a future video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.